Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Isabel is a doctor. One day, her shift turns into a nightmare. A nurse informs her that her husband, Miguel, has been in an accident with a daughter they never had. Isabel finished filling out the daily logbook, reached over, pressed the button on the electric kettle, got up from her desk, and walked over to the long unwashed window of the doctor's lounge. Dusk was settling outside. The sky frowned, unable to decide whether to pour down another cold rain or stop coddling the city below and its residents, hitting them with wet snow as a reminder that winter was near. With a sigh, Isabel gazed at the heavy gray clouds. Another gloomy day, pressing down on her almost physically. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that. Many more like this, until she forgot what sunlight even looked like. Her whole life, she had considered being born in this place a stroke of bad luck, no, a mistake. She loved the sun, the blue sky, and green leaves, yet by some cruel twist of fate, she was doomed to live in a land where, for half the year, the only visible colors were white and gray, and red, green, and yellow existed solely in the form of hats and mittens. Of the remaining 6 months, half were swallowed by rain and slush, and the brief summer barely allowed for enjoyment thanks to the swarms of gnats and mosquitoes. Isabel had always thought the climate of her homeland was downright miserable. And beyond the visual dreariness, she also faced an annual temperature shock. Every time the cold suddenly plunged to an indecent low, she would break out in a fine, irritating rash for a couple of days before trying to adjust. It took her ages, until spring, really. Because there were places in the world where it never got cold. Ever. Where the sky was always blue, the grass green and soft year-round, and the wind, if it blew at all, only refreshed the face and tousled the hair. Here, though, wind meant either frostbitten cheeks in winter or a hairstyle ruined in seconds at any other time of year. She hadn't always minded it. Maybe she was younger then, or maybe the weather had truly gotten worse with time, it was hard to say. But lately, her autumn blues had become almost unbearable. It had reached a global scale. She shivered and stuffed her hands into the pockets of her uniform coat. Her palms squeezed in with unexpected difficulty, and a wave of mild panic washed over her as she felt her waist, or rather, where it was supposed to be. There it was. Again. She'd gained weight. Not just a little, but noticeably. Her coat was tight, even the buttons strained. Horrified, she thought back to the 6 months of dieting, the daily half-hour of sweating and gasping through an online trainer's shouted commands, all to lose a few centimeters, only to gain them all back in just a couple of weeks. Which meant that for the New Year's party, she'd have nothing to wear. In 3 months, she wouldn't be able to fix this. And buying a dress 2 sizes larger? That would be against her principles. So, once again, she'd show up in her old black trousers and pretend she just hadn't had time to change. Her anxiety about her figure made her turn toward the large mirror by the entrance. The extra weight she had just felt with her hands, unfortunately, was no illusion. It stared back at her from the reflective surface. And everything above it wasn't much better. She had long needed a visit to the hairdresser to do something about those grown-out roots. Maybe even cut her hair short so she wouldn't have to struggle with styling anymore. But really, who here at work cared about her curls and blowouts? She always ended up pinning her hair into a bun at the back of her head anyway. So what was the point? If anything, it was better this way. She wouldn't attract unnecessary attention to herself. Not that there was anything to look at, anyway. Dark circles under her eyes, 3 deep furrows carving across her forehead, and eyes that weren't particularly expressive to begin with. The kettle boiled and announced it with a loud click, making Isabel flinch out of habit. She had lost count of how many times she had asked for a new kettle in the doctor's lounge. This one took twice as long to boil and clicked so loudly it made you jump every time. Isabel glanced at herself in the mirror once more, again noting with displeasure the reflection staring back at her. She sat down at her desk and, with a tinge of fear, looked at her hands. Another problem. It wasn't just the fact that she hadn't had a manicure in ages. What kind of manicure could she even maintain with her job? But her skin wasn't in the best shape either, dry, slightly cracked. And winter hadn't even begun yet. For some reason, it was her hands that finally broke her. She could still hear her grandmother's words, a woman who had always been a role model, a true lady and a wellspring of wisdom. Isabel, take care of your hands while you're young. Hands are a woman's calling card. You can tell far more about a person from their hands than from their face. And what could anyone tell from Isabel's hands? From her unevenly trimmed nails, one of them broken, her hangnails, and her reddened skin? That she was a disheveled, exhausted woman, constantly behind on everything? That she might as well be scrubbing laundry in an icy river? Yet she was a doctor. Her hands, if not perfect, should at least be in good condition. Realizing this, she instinctively hid them under the table, glancing around as if someone in the empty lounge might overhear her thoughts and judge her for them. The worse things are for a woman, the better she should look, Isabel suddenly recalled another of her grandmother's sayings. Her grandmother had every right to preach such things, she was living proof of their truth. Born before the war in a small town, she had moved to the capital to study in peacetime and had perfected the art of being a woman in every sense. One of Isabel's favorite pastimes as a child had been looking through her grandmother's old photographs. They still carried a faint, sharp scent of fixer, the chemical used to develop them. Sepia-toned or black and white, their edges cut in decorative patterns, they captured the striking figures of young men and women from a bygone era. The women, upright, full-figured yet graceful, stood in elegant dresses with collars and brooches. Even the ever-present white socks, worn with shoes or sandals, didn't diminish their charm. Their thick, curly hair was arranged in playful styles, their lips always carefully painted, and the finest accessory on their wrists was a watch. The young women of the 1950s looked into the camera with confidence, their smiles warm and sincere. There were no awkward, unattractive faces in those photographs, only a quiet, dignified beauty. Yes, we did our best to look lovely, no matter the cost, her grandmother would say, nodding at a 50-year-old photograph of herself. For ourselves, of course. But also for the men, our own and others. For all who had survived, who had returned from the front, who had conquered death. It was the least we could do, to stay beautiful, to remain women, to show that life went on. It didn't matter that there were ruins around us, that there was hunger and orphanhood. All that would pass, be rebuilt. What mattered was that we were alive. A few years after the war, Isabel's grandmother married an officer and moved with him to his hometown, a distant city. There, she gave birth to 3 children, her son, Nicholas, who would later become Isabel's father, and 2 daughters. For the rest of her life, her grandmother preserved a style that set her apart from everyone else, something that could only be described as chic. Her little hats with delicate veils were a signature look, and she stubbornly wore them despite the sideways glances, even up until the first deep frosts. Even in her old age, she continued to do her own manicures, painstakingly maneuvering her arthritic, swollen fingers through the small openings of scissors, and carefully styling her thinning, feather-light silver hair into neat curls. "I'd even do my eyeliner," she would joke, "but I'm afraid I'd miss and poke myself in the eye." So, the worse things are for a woman, the better she should look, Isabel repeated to herself, recalling her grandmother's wisdom. And things weren't going great for her at the moment. And as for her looks, well, it probably couldn't get much worse. Good thing her grandmother would never see her like this. This is awful, Isabel suddenly thought. What's wrong with me? Why is everything irritating me? The weather, my clothes, myself, even this wretched kettle. What is happening to me? Why have I become such a grumbler, such a bore? Why have I let myself go, both inside and out? I wasn't always like this. The world used to be brighter, happier, simpler. I remember. She listened carefully. The hospital corridor outside was quiet. Isabel was the attending physician on duty tonight, and so far, the shift seemed to be starting peacefully. She adjusted herself in the chair, closed her eyes, and thought. In just a few months, she would turn 32. Was that a lot? It was a decent number. as people say, a good time to take stock of one's life. So, who exactly was Isabel Franco? Despite the discouraging results of her recent self-inspection, she was still a young woman with rather pleasant features, because everything she had just criticized about herself was fixable. She was intelligent, with a good sense of humor and healthy self-irony. By most accounts, including those of competent professionals, she was an accomplished and fairly talented doctor, so much so that, according to rumors, she had a real chance of becoming the deputy head of the therapeutic department next year. Given the hospital's status and the size of the department, that was an impressive achievement for a 30-year-old specialist. She had many friends, true friends, tested by time, and even one best friend, Maria, tested by both time and life itself. Maria had been there when things were tough, not just for Isabel, but for herself as well. That was what real friendship was. And finally, up until this very moment, Isabel had considered herself successful in her personal life as well. She paused at that thought. It was curious that the word successful had come to mind. It sounded so formal, so bureaucratic. Instead of something simple, something heartfelt, happy. That was easy enough to say, wasn't it? Yes, I may not look my best. I may be annoyed by the weather, my weight, a broken kettle, the Minister of Health, the rising prices of groceries, and who knows what else. But I have the most important thing, I am happy with my husband. Then why couldn't she say that? Even to herself. Even here, alone in the doctor's lounge. Probably because she wasn't happy. The realization hit her like a shock, and she instinctively pressed her hands against her lips. Well, there it was. She had managed to overthink herself into a crisis. But that was nonsense. She and Miguel had been together for 5 years now. Disagreements and arguments? Who didn't have those? Even her best friend Maria had broken up with her husband at least 5 times, once she had even filed for divorce. And yet, soon they'd be celebrating a decade of their blissful suffering together. Miguel was a wonderful person. Honest to a fault, principled, caring, an excellent and highly respected professional, diligent, responsible, well-mannered, punctual. Incredibly punctual. That last thought made Isabel shiver. It sounded less like a description of a loved one and more like a work reference. The next logical sentence would be, he enjoys well-deserved respect from his wife. It was strange. And ridiculous. Because none of the qualities that had just come to mind had anything to do with love. Or happiness. And yet, not so long ago, everything had been completely different. Of course, Miguel had never been a carefree jokester, tossing his belongings around the house or spending money recklessly. People are different. Some are lazy, some are foolish, greedy, recklessly brave, or, on the contrary, cowardly. Miguel was serious. And that was perhaps the defining trait of his character. He approached everything with gravity, from choosing his life's work to decorating the Christmas tree. And when it came to courting Isabel, he was just as deliberate and serious. Isabel, I'm not a boy anymore, and honestly, my character isn't exactly sweet, he told her a year after they met. But I love you very much, truly love you, and I will do everything to make you happy. Though, to be honest, he added unexpectedly at the end, if I were you, I would never marry me. That was probably the first joke Isabel had ever heard from Miguel in that entire year. Maybe out of sheer surprise, she didn't hesitate for a second. But truthfully, she wouldn't have hesitated anyway, because she loved Miguel deeply and sincerely. For 4.5 years, Isabel was happy. Not with daily bouquets, love songs written for her, or spontaneous trips to the ocean, but she was happy with Miguel. They loved the same movies, the same scents, the same days of the week. They both loathed cabbage, cigarette smoke, and their neighbor from across the hall. They woke up in perfect sync in the mornings and started yawning at the same time in the evenings. Whenever Isabel bought something for Miguel, she never needed to guess the size, style, or color. It always fit him perfectly. And only he could pick out the most delicious, perfectly ripe fruits for her, the ones she had loved since childhood. With his usual serious face, he would tease her about her titanic efforts to lose weight, while Isabel giggled at what she considered Miguel's utterly pointless subscription to Amateur Fisherman magazine. Husband and wife, two peas in a pod, Isabel would say with a smile when talking about their harmony. And then, somehow, gradually and imperceptibly, a shadow crept over their life together. Over the past couple of months, Miguel had changed drastically. He had become withdrawn, and his seriousness had turned into outright gloom. He had lost weight, his face had grown gaunt, and even at home, he had started wearing long-sleeved shirts and t-shirts, as if he were always cold. "Miguel, what's wrong?" Isabel asked. "Are you feeling unwell? Let's run some tests. I don't like how you look." "Stop it, Isabel," he waved her off. "It's just a tough time at work. We're finishing up huge projects, and, as usual, a ton of last-minute issues have come up. Everything is falling apart, and I guess I'm falling apart too. Just bear with me, it'll pass. At least the pay will be good. I'll finish the project, get a solid bonus, and then we'll jet off to the sun, to the palms and the sand, just like you always dream about. Miguel, don't you think something's wrong with us? Maybe it's time we finally thought about having a child?" Isabel tried to draw her stubbornly silent husband into an honest conversation. "We've been married for 4 years, and you used to dream about having a daughter. Maybe it's time?" "Isabel, this isn't the best moment for all that," he replied. "Sorry, but I just can't think about this right now." It was as if he was forcing himself to say these words, squeezing them out with difficulty. So, Isabel hesitated, confused. "You don't have time for a child, maybe you don't have time for me either?" "I don't know. I'm not sure," Miguel muttered. That was when Isabel truly became afraid. For him, for herself, for their future. And cowardly, she backed down. After all, couldn't a person just be in a bad mood when nothing they say comes out right? And here she was, pushing him with her life questions. Miguel, who had never before left her alone for more than a day, began going away for 2 or 3 days at a time. When he returned from these business trips, he looked exhausted, completely drained. "Miguel, what is going on?" Isabel literally cornered him one evening, shocked by how gaunt he had become, the dark circles under his eyes. "What's happening to you?" "You know, Isabel, I've been thinking a lot. I think maybe we should." "Separate," Miguel finally said, not looking her in the eye. "Separate?" Isabel gasped. "Are you serious?" "Yes, no. I don't know." "I'm sorry," he said, and as if suddenly angry, slammed the front door behind him. Sometime later, he returned. Even brought her flowers. He apologized, hugged her, kissed her. He spent a long time explaining how much of an idiot he was, how exhausted, overwhelmed, and frustrated he'd been, but that he still loved her very much. She believed him. And at the same time, she didn't. The fight, it seemed, was over. But the shadow, unsettling, inexplicable, still hung over them. And now, it looked like she had finally reached the root of her current state. Could it really all come down to him? To Miguel? And to how bleak and joyless their life together had slowly become. But if that was really the case, that was terrifying. She had to do something. But what? What? Outside the doctor's lounge, night had fully settled in. Rain streaked down the window. So, winter was being postponed again. I should pour some coffee before it goes completely cold, Isabel thought, and then froze. Her instincts as an experienced on-call doctor kicked in instantly. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the ward. The air had thickened somehow. She opened her eyes slightly and straightened in her chair. Of course. Her damn intuition hadn't failed her. Someone was running down the hallway. What could have happened? She quickly ran through the list of serious and moderately serious patients in the ward. A few cases of lingering pneumonia, 3 acute gastritis patients, a couple of ulcers. None of those should be a problem. But the man with acute pancreatitis, she hadn't liked his condition during the evening rounds. Could it be complications after all? Isabel. A voice called right at the door, and a young nurse burst into the lounge. Isabel couldn't quite remember her name. Carmen? Marin? But she did know that the girl had only been working for a couple of months and had a habit of being excessively flustered. Great. Just my luck to be on shift with her, Isabel thought bitterly, remembering how recently she had spent a whole 20 minutes sorting out a mess the girl had made with patients' injections and 4 drips. Either Marin or Carmen was someone's daughter or niece, and the head doctor had quietly told Isabel. Isabel, well, it's not like gods make pottery, and honestly, I don't see a line of nurses eager to work at our hospital. Do you? So we endure, we teach, we scold when necessary. The girl, already looking perpetually disheveled from her constant fussing, now resembled a passenger who had missed her train and had been chasing it for several stations. Her hair stood on end, her face was flushed, a mask dangled from one ear, and for some reason, a button was missing from her uniform jacket. In short, she looked as if the hospital was about to be urgently evacuated to another planet, and someone had only just told her. What happened? Isabel put on her strict, authoritative expression, hoping it would immediately calm the nurse down. Why are you running through the ward? There's a phone at the nurse's station. And honestly, what is this state you're in? The girl was breathing heavily, gulping for air, and seemed unable to speak just yet. So Isabel decided to speak for her. Ramon Vinuesa, in room 3? Is it him? Has he worsened? She asked, thinking of the most critical patient that evening. But, thankfully, the girl shook her head vigorously, so much so that the mask finally flew off her ear. Then who? What happened? Isabel pushed herself up from the desk. For God's sake, speak already. Isabel, the nurse finally managed to say, swallowing even more sounds from her name than before. It's your husband. He was brought in an accident. He's covered in blood, it's horrible to look at. Isabel jumped to her feet, swayed, and nearly collapsed onto the floor. A wave of nausea surged through her, a ringing filled her ears, and her mouth went completely dry. My God, Miguel, how could this happen? Oh, he's actually not that bad, he's already been bandaged up, and he even made a phone call. Apparently, the entire time Isabel was fighting off unconsciousness, the girl had continued to chatter, suddenly finding her voice and now seemingly unable to stop. But the daughter, she's in a really bad state. Her legs twisted to the side, ribs broken, bruises and scrapes all over. I heard them calling the ICU to send a team down. Oh, Isabel. Isabel stared at the overly emotional nurse, utterly lost. Daughter? She repeated dumbly. What daughter? Whose? Well, his daughter, yours. The girl's voice held a mix of uncertainty, hesitation, and the dawning realization that she might have said something completely wrong. I don't know, Isabel. She sounded like she was trying to defend herself. There was a girl with him. The man, your husband, he said it himself, I think. He kept saying my daughter, my daughter. And the man is definitely your husband, Miguel Franco. I'm sure of it. I saw his name on the admission form, and the ER doctor said it out loud. And besides, I recognize him, your husband. I've seen him a few times. Remember when he picked you up from work? You even introduced us. Isabel instantly recalled that moment. The girl had practically tripped over herself as she ran into them outside the hospital, nodding and smiling so enthusiastically that Isabel had no choice but to introduce them. Miguel had nodded politely and, most likely, forgotten about the eager nurse 5 minutes later. But for the girl, it had clearly left a lasting impression. At least, the next day, she had greeted Isabel with a broad smile and said, Well, Isabel, your husband is quite the handsome and distinguished man. You can clearly see he's a real man. Caught up in medical history reports, Isabel nodded, not paying much attention to the girl's chatter. But half an hour later, as she approached the nurse's station, she overheard the conversation. "I never would have guessed they were husband and wife. He's so well-groomed, serious, and solid, and she ties her hair in a bun at the back of her head and runs around the wards like a schoolgirl. You wouldn't even say she's a doctor, more like one of us." As Isabel appeared in the nurse's line of sight, the impromptu discussion group quickly scattered, grabbing folders and instruments, and putting on businesslike, flustered expressions. But Carmen Marin, who was now blushing crimson, froze in place. Isabel had to remind her what the duties of a therapeutic department nurse were and advised her to keep her mouth shut. "And now, she says Miguel is downstairs in the ER, covered in blood." Well, one has to take the words of this girl with a grain of salt, or rather, divide them into halves, or even smaller bits. But she definitely knows Miguel's face. She couldn't have mistaken him. And then, she says she saw his name in the documents. Of course, her husband's name isn't exactly rare. If anything, it's rather common. There are countless coincidences in the world, but this one just feels like too much for a single occurrence. But the most ridiculous part is the story about a daughter being with him. That's utter nonsense. There's no daughter, and there never was, sad as that may be to admit. And would there be one? These thoughts swirled in her mind as she ran through the endless corridors and staircases of the large hospital, cursing the planners and builders. Their hospital had been constructed, reconstructed, and finally finished in strict accordance with the strange tradition of building real mazes on the grounds of medical institutions, where not only visitors and patients get lost, but even the medical staff, who have worked there for years. The distance from the therapy ward to the emergency department was indeed considerable and winding, and during the trip, Isabel had a flood of thoughts. One of them made her stop abruptly, gasping in fright and grabbing the nearby windowsill, once again feeling a wave of dizziness. What if it really is Miguel, her husband, and he's with a daughter? After all, just because they don't have a daughter together doesn't mean Miguel can't have one. Of course, the thought felt absurd, what a ridiculous notion to have. But that girl must have mixed something up, and if she's gotten it wrong, she won't get away with it. Isabel shuddered at the thought, but then took a deep breath and ran on. In the large emergency room of the hospital, it was quiet and bright. By the wall, a male figure sat motionless on a bench. The man was staring intently at one spot, looking completely detached. Isabel's heart sank and seemed to leap towards the exit, so much so that she feared it might literally jump out of her chest, defying all laws of anatomy. The man sitting by the hospital window was Miguel. She recognized his dark hair, slightly graying at the temples, his large nose with a bump, and his chin with a noticeable dimple. So, it was true. It was him. Her husband, Miguel. Well, now she just needed to walk up and ask him what this nonsense about a daughter was. Isabel carefully approached the man, who remained completely still on the bench, almost like a statue. But as she got only a couple of steps away from him, she suddenly exhaled in relief and almost laughed. This wasn't him. It wasn't Miguel. "Sorry to bother you," Isabel spoke to the man. "Are you really Franco?" Her words had an unexpected effect. Most likely, it was a reaction to the human voice, to someone's presence next to him. The man sobbed, leaned forward, grabbed Isabel's hand, and buried his face in her sleeve, crying loudly and violently. Isabel, completely confused, stood there beside the crying man, looking at him with fear. Finally, his sobs became quieter. He stopped trembling all over and gently released Isabel's hand, which he had held tightly for the duration of his moment of despair. He sniffled one last time, wiped his face with a handkerchief, and gave Isabel a pitiful, embarrassed smile. Once again, she was struck by how kind and open his face was, even though his eyes were red, his nose swollen, and his lips trembling. "Please forgive me, I shouldn't have, I didn't want to," he mumbled as he sat down next to Isabel. "They took Angela away, and no one is saying anything, and I just keep waiting. Angela is..." Isabel's voice faltered. "My daughter," he nodded quickly. "I can't imagine how this happened." I have no idea. There was no one, just an empty street. Where did he come from? Where? And so fast. How could this happen? What now? Did you get hit by a car? Isabel guessed, piecing together his disjointed thoughts. Yes, he nodded again. I was thrown to the side. But Angela. His voice faltered, and only a strained, painful wheeze came from his throat. Isabel rose lightly and walked over to the phone by the nurse's station in the ER. Oh, Isabel, are you on call at your tuberculosis sanatorium today? Joked the doctor from the ICU. Isabel's old friend, Marcelo, who had been teasing her throughout their years working together in the hospital. I didn't know. I'd have been on your floor by now, trying to tempt you into sin. Marcelo, listen, Isabel firmly interrupted the ICU doctor's jokes. Did you pick up a girl from the ER about 20 minutes ago after a car accident? Yeah, there's a girl, Marcelo confirmed. But she's no little girl. She's a full-grown woman, 18 years old. Pretty, by the way. So that's how it is, Isabel thought. An adult girl, not a child at all. And yet, all I kept hearing was daughter, daughter. Every time I heard that word, I pictured a little girl, around 5 years old, with 2 bows in her hair and a cute little dress. But this man has a grown-up daughter. Another clear difference from Miguel. He's older, much older. Although lately, Miguel had started looking worse and had added a few years to his appearance. Marcelo, how is she? The girl, I mean. Is it something serious? Isabel asked, feeling an unexpected sense of worry, even though it seemed odd to care about people who were complete strangers to her. Doctors can't afford to dwell on every patient they come across, otherwise, they'd never have the energy or emotional health to continue. Still, in this case, Isabel felt a sudden urge to alleviate the man's anxious weight, even if only a little. Well, how do I put it? Marcelo started, before answering her question. It's not anything too terrible. There was a suspicion of internal organ damage, and she didn't regain consciousness for a while. But now she's fine. She's awake, though her eyes are a bit glazed over, but that will pass. She's responding to questions clearly. She's asking for water, persistently, and she has some serious bruising. A tricky fracture, but our orthopedists are already taking care of it. So she'll be with us for a little while longer, and then we'll discharge her, and she can go to the trauma department. Marcelo coughed, clearly attempting to cover up his inappropriate humor. Listen, though, why are you so worked up? Is she someone you know? Oh wait, hold on. Isabel, she has the same last name, Franco, are you related to her? No, Marcelo, we're complete strangers. It's just a coincidence. There are plenty of Francos in the world, Isabel smiled. Anyway, Marcelo, have a good shift, take care. She hung up the phone and turned back to the man sitting nearby. It seemed that throughout their conversation, he had been staring at her back, as if she were the focus of all his hopes. Isabel felt guilty for spending so long talking to Marcelo on the phone, listening to his jokes, instead of giving the man a chance to catch his breath. It's all fine, don't worry, she smiled as she approached the man again. Your daughter is conscious. Her condition is stable. She'll be transferred to the trauma unit tomorrow. You should come back tomorrow so the attending physician can speak with you, and then everything will proceed normally. For now, it's best if you go home, rest, and calm down. She paused because the man suddenly grabbed her hand and kissed it. She felt a flush of embarrassment over the state of her hands, which now felt more like chicken feet than elegant ladies' hands. Thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you enough, he exclaimed. Oh, it's nothing, Isabel smiled. Especially since, in a way, we're relatives. What do you mean? The man asked, surprised. Isabel felt a wave of pity for him. He'd been through enough shock for one day. Well, not in the literal sense, she hastily clarified. We're just namesakes. I'm also Franco by marriage. But that's not the most surprising part. You see, you look so much like my husband, Miguel. I mean, you're really similar. Do you understand why I'm here? A nurse came running to me, saying they brought my husband to the ER, and apparently with a daughter too. Can you imagine my shock with all these coincidences? Isabel laughed, but quickly stopped when she noticed the man was watching her closely, with a serious expression. Tell me, is his name by any chance Miguel Franco? He's 32 years old, an engineer. And here, the man pointed to his temple, he has a mole. Now it was Isabel's turn to sit on the bench, as if her legs suddenly became jelly. What on earth is going on today? It seems like everything's right, he said, carefully sitting down next to her. You see, dear doctor, it seems this is no coincidence. My brother and your husband, how should I put it, we're brothers. I think it's called half-brothers, although I'm not sure. I've always been confused with family terms. Anyway, we have the same father, Adrian Franco. And let me finally introduce myself fully, am Franco Franco. I'm almost 7 years older than Miguel. Isabel stared at the man, stunned. If it weren't for the late realization that she was actually at work, and moreover, on a 24-hour shift, and that she was responsible for an entire department, she might have sat there for a long time, trying to process everything. But the thought of her abandoned post made her snap back into action. Okay, she jumped up, quickly adjusting her gown, and she thought for a moment that all the running, worrying, and shock had even made her lose a bit of weight. To be honest, I don't know what to say. I need to think, pull myself together. And most importantly, I need to return to my workplace. I'll be here tomorrow, of course, Manuel smiled. Isabel once again marveled at how kind and open his face looked. If you want, I'm ready to tell you everything I know. And maybe you can help me again, but in a different way, dear doctor, he added, saying something mysterious. Isabel didn't have time to find out what he meant. She nodded, quickly jotted down her phone number on a scrap of paper, handed it to him, and dashed into the corridor. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the ER for the rest of her shift. The man who claimed to be Miguel's brother, with no reason for her to doubt his honesty, was standing right in front of her. Because of him, she had even let a few things slide about the restless Carmen, Marin, who turned out to be Frida. Isabel didn't know much about Miguel's past. He didn't like talking about his childhood or youth, and he would jokingly say he was born an old man. His mother had passed away 2 years before Miguel met Isabel, and, according to him, he didn't remember his father. Supposedly, his father left his mother when Miguel was about 5 years old. You really don't remember anything? Isabel had asked. She, on the other hand, believed she could remember her life almost from the moment she was born and would get terribly upset with her parents when they would laugh at her claims about her own early childhood. I don't remember at all. And you know, Isabel, let's just end this conversation, it's pointless. My father. That man never meant anything to me. And he doesn't now. Frankly, I don't even know where he is or if he's alive. So, that's it, enough, he had said, his face twitching as though the very word father caused him physical pain when spoken. Isabel had gotten used to thinking of Miguel as someone without a past. Even at their wedding, despite her numerous relatives and family friends, he had managed to bring along a sad, though tight-knit, group of 3 college friends. Isabel, I'm probably not a very good person, that's why I'm alone. But now I have you, so I have to be better, right? Miguel had joked somberly. And now she was meeting the man who introduced himself as Miguel's brother. Amazing. Of course, she would meet this person, and maybe after this meeting, she would begin to understand Miguel better and figure out how to save their relationship because she loved Miguel. She understood this clearly when, after hearing the news that he had been admitted to the ER, a wave of overwhelming sadness and fear hit her, the fear of losing him. Manuel called her in the morning, and they arranged to meet at a cozy little pizzeria near the hospital. Finally, after finishing her shift and changing, Isabel, burning with impatience and curiosity, rushed to the designated place. Honestly, her drive to get there wasn't fueled by curiosity alone, but also by a passionate desire to eat. After work, especially after night shifts, Isabel was always terribly hungry. And now, after a 24-hour shift, with the second half of it being, if not more emotionally exhausting, at least much more physically active, she felt ready to devour an entire cow. She rushed into the pizzeria and immediately spotted Manuel. When he saw her, he stood up, waved at her cheerfully, and smiled warmly. Again, she was struck by the unusual resemblance between him and her husband. Only his face was kind. And overall, it seems like he's a good person, Isabel thought confidently as she watched Manuel signal for them to bring an enormous, golden brown pizza with bubbling cheese to her. Well, tell me, Isabel nodded as she stuffed a large slice of pizza into her mouth. But keep in mind, I still don't fully believe you. I don't fully believe myself either, Manuel smiled in response. You know, Isabel, I already gave up on this whole story, made peace with it, stepped back, and decided I'd tried enough to fix things, to get closer to Miguel. But maybe now, with your help. Because Miguel needs to understand. It was clear that the man spoke his brother's name with great caution, as if getting used to how it sounded. Tried? Isabel was stunned. You see, Franco, I don't know anything, absolutely nothing. Until last night, I didn't even know you existed. Miguel never talked about his family, and we got used to thinking of him as a solitary person, someone who finds it unpleasant, painful to recall his past. Well, that's probably true in many ways, Franco said. He suddenly fell silent, as if thinking about his next words. And now, I wonder whether I have the right to tell you everything. You do, Isabel reassured him, tackling another slice of pizza. You know, Franco, I don't like all these hidden secrets. There's been far too much confusion surrounding me lately, and I don't want it to cost me my marriage to Miguel. Maybe if I learn about his past, I'll understand what to do in the present. What do you think? Maybe, Manuel said thoughtfully. Maybe. But know this, it will be more of a story about our father and about me than about Miguel. Adrian Franco was a charming, quite talented, carefree young man, the typical offspring of a well-off, comfortable, what they would call in such cases, family. He was the only child of his parents, so, as expected, he was showered with love and care. As a result, he grew up rather spoiled. However, despite the best efforts of his numerous loving relatives, they never managed to ruin him completely. Adrian still managed to form a fairly decent understanding of what is right and what is wrong and never thought that the world owed him anything. He graduated from a school with a focus on physics and mathematics and entered a technical university, leading that carefree student life full of periods interrupted by exams, the kind most people associate with university years. Again, being a well-off guy, Adrian didn't have to worry about things like part-time jobs, finding housing, or thinking about what shoes to buy for the upcoming winter. But his fellow student, a girl named Juana, was constantly dealing with those issues. She came from somewhere far away. Honestly, Adrian didn't even know where that place was on the map. She was a rather striking brunette, who made Adrian study the map more carefully. For his part, he was a handsome, self-confident guy, a sort of star of the course, and of course, she liked him. How things happened between them, neither of them truly understood. By their 5th year, they saw themselves as adults, independent, and feeling that just a little bit more, and no one would ever tell them how to live. But a student party, which unexpectedly turned into a night together, followed by suspicions, fear, painful waiting, and, finally, the firm belief that Juana was pregnant. All of this came too soon for them. Even though they were adults, they were still children in many ways. They were scared, said a lot of awful things to each other, and went their separate ways. Adrian came to his senses first. Juana, I'm ready to take responsibility for you and our child. Let's get married, he declared. What? You can't even take responsibility for yourself, Mama's boy, she responded with unexpected bitterness. Go away, groom, and never show your face to me again." "What about the baby?" Adrian asked. "There won't be any baby," she said. She left university and went home. A couple of years later, Adrian found out that Juana had a son, his son, Manuel. He tried to piece together their shattered lives, which had never really come together in the first place. But they were too different and too random for anything to work out between them. With the help of his parents, Adrian got Juana an apartment so she could return to the city and give him a chance to be closer to his son. Manuel grew up not seeing anything wrong with the fact that his father didn't live with them but visited very often. Over time, Juana softened and even stopped blaming Adrian for her ruined life, at least when Manuel was around. Then Adrian fell in love, deeply and sincerely, pouring all the feelings he hadn't spent in his youth into this new love. Adrian and Antonia got married. Within 6 months, they had a son, Miguel, and everything seemed perfect, until life reminded Adrian of one simple truth: you can't build anything on a lie, even if it's an innocent one. Naturally cautious, Adrian was terrified to tell Antonia the truth about his other child. For years, he bounced back and forth between the two families, like a man on a frying pan, constantly summoning the courage to tell his wife, but always losing his nerve at the last moment. And he remained silent. Antonia found out on her own and didn't forgive him. Once again, Adrian, the screw-up, was cursed, but unlike Juana, who was able to understand him, Antonia couldn't. She kicked him out of the house, divorced him, and raised Miguel to believe that his father was a complete scoundrel and liar. And this long-standing method of raising him bore fruit. In the end, Miguel hated not only his father but also his brother, whom he had never met. After all, it was this other son who had ultimately taken his father away from him. "Well, at least, I think that's what he thought," Manuel smiled sadly, finishing his story. Personally, I'm not guilty of anything before Miguel. I tried to meet him a few times, but, well, I won't recount the words he used to refuse me, but that doesn't really matter, Isabel. What matters is that you're here, and maybe you can help me, help us. Because all of this is wrong, it shouldn't be like this. Dad passed away 3 years ago, living a life he thought was foolish, and he really asked me to reconcile with Miguel. He said something very interesting as he was leaving. "I'll never forget it," he said. "You have to try to put something good together from the shards I've broken." He smiled bitterly and waved his hand, then suddenly added, "Isabel, would you like to order some more?" She stared in shock at the pizza stand, from which, in her nervousness and hunger, she had just eaten the last slice. Returning home, Isabel, quiet and thoughtful, replayed the conversation she had with Manuel over and over in her mind, or rather, his story about Miguel's family. Although what family was it, really, if Miguel himself had never considered them family and, as it turned out, stubbornly rejected his brother's attempts to reconcile? What is it like to live knowing you have close relatives, someone who is blood-related to you and looks so much like you, yet still feel completely alone? No, of course, Miguel wasn't entirely alone in the world. He had Isabel. But that's not the same, it's something entirely different. And she tried to imagine what it would be like if, suddenly, her wonderful parents, her younger brother David, who, by the way, had caused her so much distress over the years that she had often regretted her parents' decision to have another child, her beloved grandmother, if all of them were to suddenly vanish from her life. But how could one live without family? Of course, her situation and Miguel's were completely different. She had grown up in a complete family, while he had only his mother. Life had unfolded that way. But now, he had a chance to fix at least part of that, if not everything, at least something, and feel the presence of someone truly close. An irreplaceable feeling. What if that's exactly what Miguel needed to get out of his dark mood, stop frowning, and finally smile? "Miguel, we need to talk seriously," she said, deciding to take the direct approach and not postpone the conversation. "I found your brother." "Well, not exactly found him, he showed up, completely by chance. I'll tell you, it's just incredible. Can you imagine?" Isabel faltered and fell silent because the look Miguel gave her was too heavy and grim, even for him. I'm begging you, he said in a voice tense with emotion. I'm asking you never to speak to me about this person. Why? Isabel exclaimed. Listen, Miguel, I met him by chance, but maybe it's fate, damn it. I talked to him for just a few minutes, but even in that short time, I realized he's a really good person and genuinely wants you two to reconcile. I haven't fought with him, Miguel said, his voice calm but still full of tension. I haven't fought, and I don't want to reconcile or even have anything to do with him. I don't need anything from this person. And I don't want him in my life. I don't want to see him now, or later, or ever again, no matter how little time I have left. Miguel's words, accidentally spilled out and unexpectedly coming from him, seemed to hang in the air. It felt like you could almost see them, hanging between them, heavy and threatening to crash to the ground with a deafening crash. Isabel took a deep breath and said, So, what do you mean by how little time I have left? What does that mean? Miguel looked at his wife in fear. His face clearly showed a desire to swallow back the words that had accidentally slipped out, and there was also a deep weariness and confusion written all over him. He couldn't hold it in anymore, as if the armor that had been keeping him together for the past weeks and months had finally cracked. Miguel sank heavily onto the sofa and waved his hand dismissively. Miguel, what's wrong with you? Tell me the truth, please. Isabel gently sat beside him. You'll find out anyway. You're a doctor. How can I hide it from you? And it's getting harder to hide every day, Miguel said bitterly, taking her hand. A few minutes later, Isabel, wide-eyed and struggling to catch her breath, sat there with a face just as bewildered as her husband's. Her first thought was to immediately go to the health committee and ask them to revoke her medical degree, as it had clearly been issued to a complete fool who didn't deserve to be called a doctor. How? How had she not seen any of this? The sudden weight loss, chills, fatigue, the bruises he hid under his sleeves. What more had to happen for her, a supposed medical expert, to finally realize that her loved one was seriously ill? Is that why you reacted so strangely when I mentioned having a child? She asked, a little more composed. And those sudden thoughts about divorce, Miguel. Is that your way of trying to get rid of me before it's too late? I. Miguel struggled to find the words. Well, you understand, how could you stand being with me when I'm completely finished? No one knows how long this will last. They say months, maybe even years. But the end is always the same. And every day it just gets worse and harder for everyone. So why should I watch you waste your life on me? Maybe you should let me decide how to spend my own life. You know, Miguel, I always knew you weren't the most cheerful person in the world, but that you're such a selfish jerk, yes, a selfish jerk, that's a real revelation to me. You spent 30 years living in your proud loneliness, and now you've decided to just end it that way? No, my dear, no way. Isabel, Miguel tried to reason with her, but she firmly interrupted him. Please, give me all your papers. Your conclusions, test results, everything you have, she asked Miguel, trying not to fall into hysteria. She spent a long time alone in the kitchen, staring at the substantial stack of documents and scans through a veil of tears. She would angrily wipe her eyes, dry her wet cheeks, read another form, and freeze again in despair. 3 months ago, Miguel had been diagnosed with a blood disease. Unfortunately, it was discovered rather late, when more radical treatments were already necessary. He had tried to hide this from Isabel. But despite the treatment, which he had secretly been receiving in another city, he was only getting worse each day. So that's what those business trips were, Isabel bitterly thought as she dialed Miguel's doctor. After some time, she learned what the medical documents had not been able to tell her. Miguel urgently needed a bone marrow transplant, but they couldn't find a matching donor for him. And, Isabel, sighed the colleague on the other end of the line. You know how it is with bone marrow donations here. People are very reluctant to come forward. They're all scared, thinking it's dangerous and painful. Try convincing someone otherwise. And from those who do decide to donate, we turn away more than half because they're not suitable. We have very little usable material to work with. But even from what we do have, nothing is compatible with your husband. It's a complete mismatch. Just totally incompatible. And we don't have much time, so I'm sorry. Yes, I understand, Isabel finally gathered herself. Listen, Arturo, the best stem cell donors are relatives, right? Yes, of course. People related by blood have high histocompatibility. In most cases, relatives are the best option for a transplant. But, as far as I know, Miguel doesn't have close relatives. At least, that's what he said. Well, we'll see about that, Isabel replied. Thank you, I'll call back later. Manuel, I'm sorry, but we need to meet urgently. Is it convenient to meet at the same place? She spoke quickly into the phone. Sure, of course. Should I order the same pizza, or a bigger one? She heard a calm voice in response, with a smile practically audible. Despite all the tragedy unfolding, the horror of what she had just learned and seen, Isabel couldn't help but smile back and somehow felt a sense of calm. A sudden confidence came over her that everything would be okay. Manuel didn't hesitate for a second. Isabel, I'm ready. I don't know if I'm suitable, but I'm almost healthy, at least healthier than many of my peers. If they consider me fit, I. His voice broke. I'm, of course, ready. There was no need for more words, no need to explain further. Isabel and Manuel sat across from each other, silent, completely forgetting about the pizza cooling on the table between them, the pizza that had been ordered by the man, impressed by Isabel's appetite. The biological material taken from Manuel was a perfect match for Miguel, and within a few weeks, he underwent a bone marrow transplant. After that, the patient made a remarkably quick recovery. Within just a couple of weeks, he stopped scaring others with his emaciation and started smiling, first awkwardly, as if learning how to do it again, but with each passing time, it became wider and more genuine. Isabel, darling, he took his wife's hand and pressed it to his lips. The operation, the transplant, the therapy. Of course, that's all right, but you saved me. After that conversation, well, when you got the truth out of me. I just wanted to live again, you understand? I suddenly realized, there she is, my Isabel, scolding me. It upset her, you see, that I wanted to die without her permission. I love her, how could I leave her alone? She'd be lost without me. Isabel, I owe you my life. Of course, you do. And please, never forget that, she nodded. But you know, I need to talk to you. You see, you're also indebted to someone else for your salvation, someone stronger than me, Miguel. He saved you, and before you start up with your inner old man routine again, please think about it. So, you were saved by the bone marrow transplant, and the only suitable donor for you was Manuel, your brother. And I want to emphasize, before you play that old record of yours again, that he became the donor voluntarily, without hesitation, despite there being some contraindications for him, do you understand? There was a risk, but he insisted. And now, here you are, alive, almost healthy, and even partially rosy-cheeked, and surprisingly, you haven't said a single bad word about your brother yet. And you won't, will you, Miguel? Miguel looked at Isabel, nodded, and started to cry. Quietly, without sound, and almost without tears. Perhaps this is how men cry when they finally understand their mistakes and realize that they can be fixed, at least in part. A year later, Isabel and Miguel were picking out a gift for Manuel. In a few days, he would turn 40, although he jokingly refused to celebrate, claiming that such a milestone shouldn't be marked if you want good things for the birthday person. You've got to be kidding, Miguel shook his head. Your hair is already starting to gray, your daughter is 18, and you still believe in superstitions like an old woman. You don't have to celebrate your birthday, but I will. I can say I got a brother for the first time, for me, truly, like this. He became embarrassed and lowered his head. Manuel looked at Isabel, winked at her, then walked over to Miguel and hugged him around the shoulders. Isabel couldn't help but admire these two strong, handsome, and masculine men, so different yet strangely similar, and most importantly, family. You know, Isabel, all of this has taught me one simple truth. What's that? Miguel looked at his wife with tenderness. I spent my whole life being angry and upset with my father, my brother, my mother, even with myself. And what was the result? I almost lost everything, my family, you, my life. And the truth is this, it's foolish to waste life on regrets and grudges. In the end, you'll only lose.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.